Alright, so I'm going to do a quick overview of the main boundary types that we have. We're talking about plate tectonics. What you can see here are data that's similar to the data that you've got in your 4 maps that we've been using in class a lot. Remember, we've got earthquakes, which is what is shown here on this map. We've got volcanoes, which we'll look at next. We've also got topography and bathymetry, so the height of the mountains and the depths of the oceans, and we've also got the seafloor age. Okay, so we're going to look at the main types of boundaries that we have, where we see them, and just an overview of the characteristics that we would find. Alright, so first one, these are earthquakes. This is very similar to what you've got. Remember, we have what we call the ring of fire. It's kind of a term. We're looking at the most active places on the earth kind of form this circle. Okay, so kind of all around here we see this circle, and that's what's known as the ring of fire. Okay, and that's kind of a term that we use that refers to this place of very high activity. Okay, it's a place that has lots of volcanoes, lots of earthquakes, and that's known as the ring of fire. Okay, so a lot of our types of boundaries that we're looking at will come from here. We're also going to look at other locations we'll look at is, centers of the oceans, like through here, where we see these strings of earthquakes. Okay, and we'll talk about these boundary types as well. Another place that we'll also talk about is right here in India. These are the Himalayan mountains. We'll talk about them as one type of our plate boundaries as well. Okay, I'm going to switch to this next slide, and we'll probably hopefully see some overlap between our ring of fire and the things that we looked at. Okay, so we're very similar on here. I'm going to move this just up a little bit so that our ring of fire lines up a little better. Okay, so again, we can see that volcanoes are very much in a similar place. We've got volcanoes through here. We've even got some volcanoes here where we had Himalayans marked. So we can see that there is some overlap. And if you've finished your Discovering the Plate Boundaries assignment, you'd also see, there is a lot of that overlap and what happens. So what we're going to do here on this section is our plan is to identify, so we're going to identify the characteristics at each plate boundary. Okay, so we're looking at different plate boundaries. Change the color on this so we can see that. So we're going to look for characteristics at each boundary type. The boundaries that we're looking for are going to be, we have convergent, we have, let me try this again, okay, so we've got convergent. Another type that we have is divergent. And our third type that we are looking at is transform. Okay, so we're going to have these 3 boundary types, and we're going to add some classifications next to each of these. Okay, and we're looking at what happens with earthquakes, what happens with volcanoes, what happens with the seafloor age, and what happens with the height and the depths of the oceans at those places. All right, so let's first look at these. This is going to fall under our divergent boundary, and I'm going to just write some text out here so we can see what is happening. All right, so divergent is where our plates are moving apart. Okay, so this is where plates are moving apart. Okay, so we got 2 plates that are together and they're going to separate. If we look at this picture that's here on the left, You know, an example of where this happens is between the African plate and the South American plate. So this is in the Atlantic Ocean where these things are moving apart. So I'm going to come back and show you exactly where we're talking about. If we're looking here, we're talking about, I'm just going to highlight this for you. We're talking about right through here. Okay, so this is a divergent boundary. Alright, so if we look back here at this slide, we're talking about, again, the South American plate and the African plate moving apart from each other. Okay, so we're looking at these plate boundaries. We've got the divergent boundary here. That's where they're moving apart. So I'm going to put this on here that it's where it's moving apart. So our plates are spreading. Okay, so down here underneath is where we've got our mantle, and this is actually more specifically what we call our asthenosphere. Okay, and you've got a lab that looks at the layers and a reading assignment that covers the asthenosphere as well. But when these plates move apart, that mantle or magma can come up and it can cool. Okay, it's what causes some cooling and becomes new ocean crust. Okay. Okay, and when that comes up, the new crust is less dense. So new crust is less dense, and the old crust is more dense. I'm going to show you where those are. Okay, so we've got more dense here on the edges. And we've got less dense here in the middle. Okay, and again, the more dense is also older, and the less dense is also younger crust. Okay, as that pushes up, it helps to spread them apart. Okay, we also have here, let me change colors so we can see this a little better. We have ridges. As that new magma or new melted rock comes up, it makes a ridge, and we get what we call the mid-ocean ridges. And that is something that's very important for identifying divergent boundaries. And if you look on your topography and bathymetry, you'll notice that it's more shallow along those plate boundaries. Okay, so that's where we get our mid-ocean ridges, is right along there. And as that crust then moves out, it gets older and more dense, those ridges fall down. Okay, so that is divergent boundaries. I'm going to erase everything that's over here so we can keep all of our text on the right for the next slide that we're looking at. We don't want to lose everything that we've written over there. We want to keep it around. Okay, so we can just get rid of all of this stuff from divergent boundaries. Again, we want to be able to identify them and talk about their characteristics, so I've kept those recorded on the side. The next type we're going to look at is convergent boundaries. Convergent boundaries is where where they are coming together. Okay, and when we have this, we're worried about basically three types of crust. Okay, so we've got two types of crust and three boundaries. So we have oceanic crust, which obviously comes from the ocean, and we have continental crust, which obviously comes from continents. Okay, and that gives us three types of convergent boundaries. We can have ocean to continental, we can have ocean to ocean, and we can also have the last option, continental to continental. Okay, and each of these convergent boundaries has different characteristics and do a little bit different things, but they have some similarities. So we're going to start with some of the similarities. We have earthquakes that become deeper as we move along. And those earthquakes get deeper, we also have what is called a subduction zone. Okay, subduction zone. Okay, I'm going to show you the subduction zone on this image over here. Sorry, I'm going to fix that so you can actually read what I'm trying to say. Okay, so we're going to have our subduction zone, and that is, switch this color, I can show you. That is this part right here. Okay, so the subduction zone is anything that has gone below the surface. Okay, that's the piece of the crust that goes below. Okay, so when this is an example of a continental and oceanic crust meeting. So we've got oceanic here, and we've got continental crust here. Okay, and this old oceanic crust is dense. Okay, so this is again like we talked about, as our crust, oceanic crust moves away from our divergent boundaries, it gets more dense, and that's why it sinks under our continental, which is less dense. Alright, so what happens is when this sinks under, we get this part right here. I'm just going to highlight this for you. Do it in yellow. Right there. So we can see that V. I'm going to draw a little line on that V for us as well. So we can see this V. Okay, so we form these V's, and that is called a trench. Okay, so we get these trenches wherever we have these ocean to continental convergent boundaries. That's very, very deep. This is very similar to what's happening in our project at Edenton, Oregon. That is called the Cascadia Fault, and it results from one of these convergent boundaries. So that'd be something that'd be important for you to share with the townspeople and the community members and the city council. Okay. What happens though is we see these earthquakes. These dots down here are all earthquakes, and as you notice, they're changing color, and that's because they're getting deeper and deeper. So those earthquakes get deeper and deeper because they're coming from this piece of lithosphere, and you've seen that in your data. We've seen that those earthquakes get deeper and deeper as they go inland, and the reason is because they're coming from that piece of plate boundary. Another thing you've also would have seen on your maps that we've been looking at is this right here. So you'll notice that these Andes Mountains are formed, and there are volcanoes here. Okay, and we've seen those lines of volcanoes on our maps as well. What happens is this, as it goes underneath, it heats up and it melts, and as it melts it rises up, forms these mountains, and causes these volcanoes. Okay, so there's my volcanoes erupting. Alright, so those are all caused by this convergent boundary. Okay, alright, so I'm going to erase those. We're going to look at another type of convergent boundary, one of our other classifications. Again, it's going to be very similar because we're dealing with the same type of boundary, but when we're dealing with different types, we're talking oceanic or continental, we get some characteristics that are a little bit different. Okay, so bear with me, I'll quickly erase this and we'll move on. Okay, that's pretty good. We got rid of most of everything. Alright, so let's look at this next image, this next option. So here we've got an ocean to oceanic. We've got very similar things. We've still got earthquakes that are doing the same things as they did before. They're getting deeper as we move along. This is an example from the Australian and the Pacific plates. And when this happens, we typically form islands. Okay, so we can see that this is where we're getting islands. Some other places, we get this like Japan, off of the peninsula in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and a lot of our islands in the Asian area where we see lots of trenches. Again, we've got trenches here where we see those trenches. We see that next to those islands, we've got all of these volcanoes. Again, we are melting part of this oceanic that comes over, that comes up. It forms these islands, and those are all volcanic islands. Okay, so very, very similar things to what we see on convergent boundaries, but instead we're just dealing with ocean to ocean. Here, whichever plate is more dense is the one that goes under. Still, which one goes under and which one becomes our subduction zone. Again, here's our subduction zone. Again, that's determined by density. Okay, so whichever one is more dense is the one that's going to sink. So density, again, is still important here. All right, so let's look at, erasing this. We're going to look at our last type of convergent boundary. We're going to look at continental to continental. Okay, so here we're looking at continental to continental, and we're going to see some very similar things as before. We don't have as much of a trench here because we're dealing with two things that are about the same density, much harder for them to push under. And we have a little bit of a difference here in that instead of melting and causing volcanoes, we are pushing up to form mountains. Okay, so these collide and these form mountains. Alright, so we're building up these two continental crusts into each other. And an example, what we've got here is the Indian plate slamming into the Eurasian plate. So the Eurasian plate's here, the Indian plate comes up and smashes into it, and it builds up into those Himalayas, or Mount Everest. That's what, the tallest mountains in the world are formed by these convergent continental to continental plates. We still have earthquakes. Okay, so we still have those earthquakes. They're not as distinct of the same pattern of getting deeper as we go along. We still technically have a subduction zone, but it's not as pronounced. It's not as obvious as the other ones that we've had before. Okay, so we still have them, but since we're dealing with continental to continental, things aren't as obvious and things aren't as pronounced. But the best example of this, if we're looking for the #1 example of this in the world, is going to be the Himalayas and the Eurasian and the Indian plate, where those make the Himalayan mountains. Okay, and Mount Everest comes from there as well. Okay, so those are the best example of a continental to continental boundary. So we've covered all three types of the convergent boundaries. We're now going to look at the last type of boundary that we need to cover is transform boundaries. Okay, transform boundaries, so we've had divergent, which is moving apart, convergent, which is moving together, and we've now got transform, which is them moving side by side. Okay, so again, the best example of this is going to be in California with the San Andreas Fault. So basically what we have is this plate is moving this direction, and this one is sliding past it this direction. Okay, and what we've got is this one line right here that's a transform boundary. And this is something that makes transform boundaries more difficult to find on our large worldwide maps of data. We're talking convergent, we've got the whole side of the South America plate and the whole side of the Nazca plate running into each other. Or we've got the whole North American plate and the whole Cascadia Pacific plate running into them. When we're talking about transform, we're usually talking about much smaller areas, so they're hard to recognize. But some of the key things that we're looking for, and I'll put them down here, is that we're sliding past each other. We will have lots of earthquakes, but they're going to be shallow. So we have lots and lots of shallow earthquakes. Okay, we will also have volcanoes, but they're going to be spread out over a lot of area. Okay, we're going to have spread out volcanoes. And we've really got nothing special happening with our topography. We're not making mountains, we're not making trenches, we're not making ridges. We've basically got nothing special in our topography, and we're obviously not making any new crust, so we've got nothing special on our geochronology. We're kind of just looking on these two things, lots of shallow earthquakes, and we've got spread out volcanoes over an area, and our best one is going to be the San Andreas fault. Alright, so what we're going to look at last, I'm going to clear all of this, so pause it and get all the notes that you need if you need them. Last thing we're going to look at is what makes these things move. What makes all this stuff happen. Okay, so we're going to look at these two things. So we're going to talk about divergent boundaries, what happens, and we're also going to talk about at convergent boundaries, what helps things to move. Alright, so I'm going to kind of replicate this example with divergent boundaries. Okay, so if we got two plates here and we're watching them and they're pushing apart, okay, so they're going to be moving away from each other. So like we've got here, so we're moving away, we're moving away. Okay, so these two plates are moving away. One of the main things that makes these plates move is our convection cycles, and you can see that. So a convection cycle is where we get hot mantle moving up, and it pushes against those plates, and as it cools off, what it's going to do is it then falls back down to the, towards where the core is. Okay, so it makes these cycles just like when you're, boiling water or whatever. You're going to have these convection cycles as well. Okay, if you're heating something on the stove, it's going to be the same thing. So what we get is these convection cycles that are going different directions. Okay, so again we've got hot down here from the mantle, and they cool off at the top. Okay, hot and cool, and so we're going to have these cycles, and we can see them over here on our map as well. Okay, so what we get is this term that's called ridge push. Okay, and that's right here where we make this ridge at the center of our divergent boundaries. That building up of that ridge, that new crust coming up and kind of folding out, it's like a conveyor belt. Okay, so it's pushing up and putting new crust out, and this happens over a long time, but it helps to push our plates out. So that's a main thing that causes our plates to move, is these convection cycles and also this ridge push that's pushing it out. Okay, the other option that we have is what we call slab pull, and we're going to look at that on a convergent boundary. So let's say we've got a boundary that's coming across, and this is our subduction zone that goes off underneath, and it's going to come across here to our other plate, and this is running into this plate over here. Okay, so this is again our subduction zone, alright, and it's moving off this direction. Okay, what happens is, again, we've still got those mantle convection cycles. Okay, so we're still having convection cycles, and that's helping to move stuff along. And okay, so again, when things get hot, it pushes, they start to rise, and when they get to the top, they start to cool, and then they fall down. Okay, we also have convection cycles over here that are doing the same thing. Okay, they're pushing our plates in specific directions. Okay, so when we talked about before, if this crust is usually much more dense than other crusts that we have, that's where we get another force. Just like we had ridge push before, if this is more dense, then we get what's called slab pull. Okay, and you can see that over here on this diagram. We've got slab pull, and I'll highlight it again. So we're looking right here, okay, at these parts that are sinking on there. We get this slab pull because it is more dense. it starts to get pulled by gravity down underneath. Okay, so gravity is starting to have a role here, and it's pulling that piece of that plate underground. Okay, so those are things that again help move our plates. So just to summarize, we've got our convection cycles of hot and cold moving around that pushes against our plate. We also have ridge push. So as we push new crust out, it pushes those plates outward. And we also have slab pull. So as that goes under, it pulls that plate underneath. Okay. So those are our main things that cause our plates to move, and that is also an overview of the three main types: convergent, divergent, and transform boundaries, and the different characteristics that they have.